Thank you. So on behalf of the organizing committee and Dragonfly Mental Health, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining the last block, which is a Pacific time block of the Minds Conference. My name is Alaa Alsaafin, and I, along with Sarai Guerrero, will be the session chairs for this time zone block. What started out as a conversation among 4 friends and graduate students turned out to be the first international mental health conference in academia. So we are very truly grateful for your participation here today. And none of this work would have been possible without the organizing team of over 30 members and support of our partners, Dragonfly Mental Health. Please don't forget that you can support Dragonfly Mental Health through donations on their website. Special thanks goes to our other partners, PhD Balance, Voices of Academia, Cactus Foundation, Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health, Convergence Science Network, and IMS International for spreading the word about this great initiative. As an organizer affiliated with the University of Toronto in Canada, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have had this opportunity to work on this land. We also wish to acknowledge and are grateful for the traditional Indigenous lands that all of you work and live on, no matter where you are joining us today. In the PT time block, we have an exciting program that includes the basics of burnout, which is the session, a panel on career and mental health stories, a roundtable on how to draft and implement a student supervisor agreement, and a discussion group on mental health during and beyond the pandemic, with a special focus on international students. We do hope they enjoy these sessions and connect with the speakers and other attendees. Now, before I move on and give the virtual mic to our speaker today, I would like to get some housekeeping items out of the way. So first, feel free to turn on your video, but we kindly ask that you turn off your microphone while the speaker is presenting. We've also enabled closed captioning, and you may turn this on or off by clicking the arrow next to the live transcript button at the bottom panel of your Zoom window and selecting show or hide subtitle. We'll be recording and streaming these sessions, and we'll be stopping the recording for the last part once the speaker has finished the talk. And this allows attendees to be able to ask their questions and not feel free that they need to do so in a recorded setting. We also want to provide a trigger warning as some sensitive topics may be discussed. If you feel that any of these topics are triggering or upsetting to you, whether during this session or in other sessions, we encourage you to step away and come back as needed. And we also want you to know that this is a supportive environment. That being said, we are not a healthcare professionals, and we do not provide counseling or therapy. You can visit our website at mindsinacademia.com/resources to refer to the collected resources. We kindly ask you to remain respectful of others, and inappropriate behavior or comments will not be tolerated, and they may result in your removal from the conference. If you need any help during the session, please contact IT in the Zoom meeting or email us at minds.conference@gmail.com. Feel free to enter questions in the chat, and I will be able to read them to our speaker today. And if you want to stay anonymous, you could also directly message me on Zoom for any questions. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Wendy Ingram. Dr. Ingram is the co-founder and CEO of Dragonfly Mental Health, which is a non-profit organization dedicated to cultivating excellent mental health among academics worldwide. She's a research scientist at Gainsborough Health and working on biomedical informatics that aim at improving mental health care outcomes. And with that, I would like to pass on the virtual mic to Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back here. I actually helped launch the whole conference with a mental health literacy talk for me, my time last night. So now it is just past noon in Pacific time where I'm at now. So I'm so pleased and happy to be back to present a new and different talk, Basics of Burnout, the causes and remedies in a research environment. And so hopefully now you're seeing a nice screen with just my slides, not the presenter view.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Again, this has been such an incredible thing to see get put together and go from idea to manifestation by the organizers here, and happy to have played a small part in that, and super happy to be here presenting this today. So to start off, I will just reiterate a couple of things. So if at any point you become triggered or you have a moment where you need to take some time, please do so. This is a supportive environment. We welcome you to come and go as you need. And there's also the website for the Minds Conference with resources. And in addition, I know there's a lot of people from all over the world. And so if you need a 24-hour 7 days a week hotline or to call, identify what your local emergency services are, this website, IASP info /resources/crisis centers, is an excellent source for finding that information as well. So I will re-emphasize that Dragonfly Mental Health itself is also not a healthcare provider organization. The information that we're going to provide today is evidence-based, but it does not qualify as medical advice and does not substitute for speaking to medical professionals that can help you with your or your loved ones' care and needs. So with that said, the outline for this 1-hour seminar is I'll give a very brief personal and Dragonfly mental health introduction. I will then go over the basics of burnout. So we're not going to go into extensive detail, but we are really interested in explaining what is burnout, what causes it, and what are the things that work to treat it. And then we'll touch on at the end the differences between burnout and depression and anxiety, because these things are different. So we'll touch on that, and happy to go into much more detail during the Q&A, both the recorded portion and the unrecorded portion. So have those questions ready. Go ahead and put those in the chat or the direct message to Alaa, and we will have those read out a little bit later. So away we go. So I'm Dr. Wendy Ingram. I am a specialist in mental health informatics. I received my PhD in molecular and cell biology from UC Berkeley in 2015 and completed a postdoctoral training program in psychiatric epidemiology at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in the Department of Mental Health back, and that was from 2015 to 2020. So I finished last year, and in addition to this research that I do in mental health informatics, I have been really active in by students for students, or by academics for academics, grassroots movements since 2013, when I was a graduate student myself. And it's just been the biggest pleasure of my life to have met with the other co-founders of Dragonfly Mental Health, put our time, our heads, and our effort together to establish a nonprofit organization that's global and is going to be addressing all of the needs and issues within academia over time as we have capability. So it's been really amazing to work with these folks from around the world. We operate in 3 ways. We work to improve knowledge, address culture directly, and build community. And we really base this on the fact that no one knows academics like academics themselves. And so we wanted evidence-based solutions delivered by people we trust and know, understand where we're coming from, and what we experience in the academic space. And so we're inherently global, just like academia is, and we've recruited over 250 volunteers from around the world, over 30 different countries and many, many different disciplines. We conduct research and address systemic issues at large. We're creating long-term solutions for that. We also actively build worldwide community of academics that care about mental health in Dragonfly Cafe. So this is a weekly held, free to join peer support space. It's really wonderful, and we've had on the order of over 800 people participate over the last 18 months that we've been running these, and it's really a phenomenal place, and I love spending time there myself. And then the third thing that we've been doing, which has just really been capturing the minds and hearts of so many people, is our on-campus program. So we are creating cultural and climate changes directly in academic communities by providing mental health literacy talks, skills training, and anti-stigma campaigns, as well as providing what's the word for it? We advise people. Anyways, my head is kind of spacing out right now. But anyways, we are we provide supportive services to universities directly in order to build out their supportive communities. So, like I said, we've got an incredible number of volunteers. We would welcome anyone who's interested in learning more or joining us to do so. It's really a phenomenal group of people that is really, really fun to work with. And we really focus on trying to deliver comprehensive change. And we've identified 5 domains of excellence that are required for this within a community. And that involves establishing departmental committees, peer networks, as well as the 3 things that our on-campus program delivers directly, which are mental health literacy talks, skills workshops, and anti-stigma campaigns. So get in touch with us if you want to work on any of those things. And so before we get into the basics of burnout, I'm going to present a few poll questions. And if you are up for it, please put in your in the chat A for yes, you have felt this way in response to the question, or B, no, you've never felt this way, just so we get a sense of a few basic topics that are related to burnout. So the first question is emotional exhaustion. So do you feel worn out at the end of the working day? So type A if you do feel worn out at the end of the working day on a regular basis, and B if the answer to that question is no. We've got a lot of A's, A. Okay, but some diversity. There are folks who don't feel that way. So that's great. And depersonalization. So now let's do the second question. Do you feel callous or detached from people or activities at work? So give me A for yes or B for no, or many A's if this happens all the time or you feel this on the regular. So a lot of A's again, a lot of A's, a couple B's. Yeah, unfortunately, A. And you know what I'd like to emphasize here is just there's a lot of other people feeling like that as well. It's not just you. And so the third one, personal achievement. So do you feel accomplished at work on a regular basis? So type A if that's true, or B if that's not true. Yeah, so this is a little bit of a rough, and we're getting a lot of A, B, B, A, sometimes yes, sometimes no, and that's natural and normal too. But it's also if you don't feel accomplished at work on a very regular basis, on a daily basis, these are things that if you are experiencing emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and lack of personal achievement at work, you and in research and in your studies, these are things that really are indicators and components of burnout. So now, Dragonfly Mental Health is always talking about mental health as a spectrum. And so I want to move on and just touch on, if you were able to attend one of the earlier mental health literacy talks, I went into more detail about this, or Sarai did. So I'm going to not go into extensive detail, but suffice to say, there's a whole spectrum of natural health within which people can move between these states. So mentally healthy state, to a stressed state, to a distressed state, which is beyond just stress, takes a little bit more to get back to that mentally healthy state, a disease state where you are diagnosable by a professional to meet the criteria for a diagnosable and treatable disease, and crisis, someone who needs to have help in that moment in order to get the care that they need. And so people, move around between all of these states within the spectrum, and there's there's gradations between them as well. And so a lot of people ask, where am I on this mental health spectrum? And that's a great question to ask. And if you can't answer that, and you can't talk to people that that you trust, to start to try to figure out where you are on that spectrum, talking to a professional is a phenomenal way to respond to, I don't know where I am on this spectrum. It's definitely more than stress, but I don't know if it's disease. Professionals can help you identify where you are on this and what kind of interventions, what kind of things and supports you can do to get yourself back to that mentally healthy state, right? So where does burnout fall on this? Technically, not a disease. So it's really in between this distress and disease state on this mental health spectrum. So one of the things that's really important about talking about burnout in the academic setting is because postgraduate education really is a pretty unique situation that not a humongous amount of people end up participating in. Only about 18 million people worldwide would meet the criteria of they're in postgraduate education program, or they're currently a postdoc or resident, they've achieved their degrees, but they're still in the training process, or they're faculty affiliated with teaching and academic institutions conducting research, things like that. There's only about 18 million of us worldwide. And so most universities are starting to develop these wellness programs, but they don't tend to target graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, or faculty. And this is a really unfortunate aspect, because what we also know is that by not targeting these folks, postgraduate and above, they're not as effective, and they're not being tested for efficacy too. So that's also a problem. And once you get to that postgraduate education, the cultural and systemic barriers that make graduate students and faculty less likely to seek support, even if they know that they're struggling with things. And so there's some really interesting cultural and systemic issues that are at play there. And in addition, postgraduate education and faculty positions come with unique pressures and culture that seem unrelenting often at times. So, we really are under an extensive amount of work stress, and that's what leads to burnout. So, like I said, the World Health Organization doesn't recognize burnout as a diagnosable disease itself, but it is recognized as a syndrome resulting from specifically chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And the three things that I asked you questions about at the beginning map directly onto what burnout causes. What are the symptoms of burnout? So these are feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's jobs, or feelings of negativism, cynicism related to one's jobs or people that they work with, and reduced professional efficacy. So who can suffer from burnout? As it turns out, anyone doing a goal-directed activity. So technically speaking, the World Health Organization couches it in work, but volunteership, being a student, being an athlete, being a student athlete, parenting, caregiving, doing people work, clinicians, anyone doing any goal-directed activity can get overly stressed and induce these exact symptoms and syndrome. And so the core components and symptoms, there are some things that you can look at in the mirror. You can self-reflect and identify certain things. And so those can involve, are you feeling emotionally or physically exhausted? Do you seem to have reduced emotional regulation? So are you flying off the handle because the person at the cafe gave you a latte instead of a cappuccino? Are you bursting into tears suddenly when someone says something that, you know, really normally wouldn't get that level of a reaction? Are you getting very angry about things that you know, should be simple and under normal circumstances you don't respond that negatively to? Cognitive impairment. So are you noticing that you're slower in thoughts? Are you losing words like I was earlier? Not to say that I'm burnt out, but you know, are you having trouble word finding? Are you struggling to keep up with things at work, with seminars, with things like that? Reduced memory or attention. This is related to, and sleeping problems. So is your sleep not as restful? Are you having trouble falling asleep, staying asleep? Are you waking up in the middle of the night? These are all things that you can reflect on your own to see if that are core components and symptoms. And then another big piece of burnout that you can notice is either reflected back to you by others, or when you notice being around others, some of these things are happening. And so extreme irritability or avoidance, withdrawal, and distancing yourself from others. You don't want to participate in things that you used to before. Perhaps you're not performing as good as your peers or as good as you used to in group activities. Perhaps you have an increased inflexibility that you used to be really go with the flow, and someone changed the plan on you last minute, not a problem. Now you're a lot more you know, stringent, and it's a lot more difficult for you when your boss says, oh, so we're going to completely change this section of the paper, and now we're going to add in these 3 figures on a manuscript that you just spent the last 6 months working on. You know, how much are you responding negatively to that? Are you adaptable or are you inflexible? And then again, cynicism, just this belief, you can develop with burnout, a belief that you know, it's never going to get better. There's nothing you can do. These people just don't care. My boss doesn't care about me. My lab mates will never pick up the slack. You know, just this negativity and cynicism that isn't normally there can really be something that you notice in the interactions you have with people. So burnout is situational, whereas, you know, we'll get into it a little bit more later, the difference between burnout versus diagnosable depression or anxiety, which have some of the same symptoms. Burnout really is situational. And so you may be able to contain or manage your symptoms. And this is very, very common among folks who end up in academia. We often have very high intelligence, very high functioning, lots of coping strategies. We're highly resilient, which is what has allowed us to achieve at such high levels. But this high functioning, this masking, this ability to deal with many, many different situations can play against us in these situations, because we'll just keep going because we haven't crumbled yet. And you know, the research and the literature really shows that the high functioning individuals, the people who can keep going and going and going, even though they're experiencing all of these signs and symptoms of this syndrome, you're still going to crack at some point. This is not good for you, and it is reducing your performance, let alone your enjoyment of your day-to-day life and your relationships. So There's a very common misconception, especially among high achieving individuals, that it's not lethal. So I really just need to learn to live with it. And this is really unfortunate because every day may be different and require different management. But it's the looking at everything over a course of time. Is it more frequent than not that you're feeling really burnt out? And so burnout is also not static. It's not something that you reach and then just stay there permanently. It is something that can have a lot of ups and downs. You can be better for a few days or a few weeks, and then it comes on again. But it's also not inevitable. So it's definitely something that we need to and can prevent and work against, as well as deal with it as directly as we can when it is obvious that it's taken hold. So you can also be burnt out in only one dimension. So only have it be work related. And then when you leave work, your family, your friends, your sleep, your experiences are all great. But it tends to also impact other aspects of your life too. So the causes are really well defined now. And so it involves chronic stress relating to work or other ongoing activities, lack of control over your environment, your schedule, your assignments, things like that. Really comes forward if you have an unescapable bullying or toxic work environment or relationship. So having harassment in the work environment, in the lab, being bullied, having a really toxic relationship with your supervisor or colleagues. These things can be really, are absolute causes of burnout. And then, this catch-all phrase, work-life imbalance. Something that a lot of us in academia do is taking on extra job duties, but we're often not given the authority in order to pursue those things the way that they need to be pursued for it to be effective and efficient and to feel fulfilled. And then another thing that can really cause burnout very quickly is when you're being asked to do things for your job that are disconnected from your values. And in addition, and this is also something that a lot of us folks in academia get sucked into, is lack of identity beyond work. So succumbing to the pressure within academia that it has to be all science all the time, or all your studies all the time. If you're not thinking about your research or working on the weekends, then you don't care enough about science. And that is just not true at all. It is a ridiculous concept that we need to break. And we are multi-dimensional beings with friendships, with interests, with passions, with other things that we need and want to be doing. And we have to try to maintain that. And that we know that that is one of the major causes of burnout. So really, this has come into a lot more focus in the business world. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what people, and organizations like the Harvard Business Review have been focusing on and done and shown in some studies. So in 2016, this idea of the burnout cycle became presented and was really instrumental in leading a lot of companies to take notice of this and take better care of their employees. So I think that academia can benefit from this tremendously. So by the causes that we just already discussed lead to the symptoms. The symptoms, unfortunately, worsen the situational causes in most cases. And then you ultimately end up with lower employee satisfaction, accomplishment, and productivity. So we have to break the cycle when we can. So some studies done published just recently in 2020, a Gallup poll interviewed over 12,000 respondents around 2019, and we're looking at employee work-related burnout and some of its effects. And so one of the things that they found was that 76% of employees experience burnout on the job at least some of the time. This is overwhelmingly most people. So it's really, really tough. And, most people said sometimes, but a huge chunk, 21% said very often, and 7% said always. And this is looking at 12,000 people from a whole different variety of jobs. This is in academia. I suspect that it's higher in academia. But the burnout impact both health and productivity. So it behooves both the individual and the employer or the academic organization that's in charge of your learning and your training to address burnout as early as possible. Because what the Gallup poll found was that people who were experiencing burnout were 63% more likely to take a sick day. They were 23% likely to end up visiting the emergency room. They were half as likely to discuss with their manager about their performance and how they could do better, and 2.6 times as likely to be seeking another job. So, talk about a leaky pipeline in academia. You can't do that without acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is burnout. And then folks were 70% less likely to experience burnout if they were given enough time for assignments. And so having these short timelines that are way too little for actually achieving these goals is a huge, major player. That's an interaction between the bosses and the employers and the employees. And so just having sufficient time it massively reduces the likelihood of developing burnout. So burnout in academics during the pandemic is also, as everyone has recognized, fortunately, the pandemic has emphasized how big of a problem stress and mental health issues are, because it's affected everyone all at once. And so in a survey of US academics by the Chronicle of Higher Education, 69% reported feeling stressed, 68% felt fatigued, 35% felt angry. And more than 50%, more than half, said they were seriously considering changing their career or retiring early. So, and this is something now that I have heard from people at every level, trainees, but also from fully tenured professors that are at the height of their career, extremely well funded. They're leaving academia. They're making plans. So it's a serious problem that's going to affect us at all levels here. But the emphasis and the biggest issue really is for junior scientists, because the crisis has magnified stresses that are already present in the academic system, and it's very disproportionately affecting historically marginalized individuals and groups. So women, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ individuals, anyone who is from a historically marginalized or excluded group from academia is getting hit harder by these things. So what helps? We are a solution-focused organization at Dragonfly Mental Health. We really, really always want to emphasize that when there's a problem, there's a solution. And what is it that's going to actually help us? So we know from the literature, it's beautiful. They've studied this really, really well, especially among clinicians, but it's generalizable to any group of people as well. And so social support is critical, not just self-care. Learn to meditate is great advice, but it's not only about your self-resilience, your self-care. It really requires institutional and social support. And so we always try to emphasize that. But the things that have been shown demonstrably to improve burnout symptoms and reduce burnout, prevent burnout, are taking breaks or vacations, completely detaching from work, turn off the cell phones, set up an away message, and really just let it go. oscillation between rest and effort. So this is something that needs to be built into your schedule and built in as a habit. So for every 50 minutes of work, creating a 10-minute break. They can be necessary, they can be efficient, or they can be joyful breaks. But taking those regular breaks is really important to avoid burnout on a day-to-day basis, as well as over time. So you can eat, drink, go to the restroom, or take a break, schedule them so that you can go to the printer every 50 minutes. Get up, move around, coffee with colleagues, go and enjoy, make sure that you're cultivating good relationships, because seeking support and building better relationships at work is known to reduce burnout as well. And then another piece that's a little harder, but is really, really important, is negotiating better working hours, getting the accommodations you may need, or establishing better communication with your supervisor, with your mentor. And then in addition, what really does help and has been shown to help are these things that involve mindfulness, getting better sleep, more sleep, and establishing a normal exercise routine. So these things really help with burnout. Other advice from folks at Dragonfly were to try not to internalize burnout as a failure. Burnout is really a consequence of a system that expects people to work far too long of hours and sacrifice their personal lives. This is not the way it should be, and we do need to work together in order to change that system and shine light on that system, because it's not a personal problem. It's usually that the stress is being induced by a dysfunctional or poorly planned system. So creating ways and identifying ways that work for you to detach from stress, and really normalizing conversations around mental health. Fighting isolation. So Dragonfly Cafe was something that at the very beginning of the pandemic, we heard from our volunteers that they were feeling very isolated and that their mental health was struggling. And so we created the cafe for that express purpose, to fight isolation and to normalize conversations about mental health and how we're doing. And one of our volunteers in particular really likes this analogy of treat yourself like a tree. Sun, water, air, nutrients, grounding, and space. These are all things that humans and trees need to survive and thrive. So again, just to recap, the symptoms of burnout is that it's work-related, it's emotional or physical exhaustion, reduced resilience and adaptability, cynicism about work and colleagues, reduced performance and concentration. The causes are chronic stress related to work and other ongoing activities, lack of control, bullying and toxic work environment and relationships, and work-life imbalance. And what helps? We know from the literature, taking breaks or vacation, negotiating better hours or accommodations, and improving communication, seeking support and building better relationships at work, and mindfulness, sleep, and exercise. So in contrast, I want to explain what mood disorders and anxiety are, because if none of these things work, you might be experiencing something that's a diagnosable disease, such as a mood disorder like depression or bipolar disorder, or an anxiety disorder. And so anxiety is highly comorbid with depression and bipolar disorder, but also can exist alone. And in the general population, there's a lot of people who experience these signs and symptoms, about 6.7% or 6%, depending on which illnesses you're talking about, point prevalence. So that means today, about 6% or so of folks will meet criteria for these illnesses. However, in academia, this is much, much higher. It's 6 to 8 times higher. And so this is really a huge problem within academia that does need to be looked at and evaluated. And if you meet criteria for that, you need to talk to clinicians, get connected to the clinical help, the psychological care that is going to help you get better. So the symptoms there involve some of the same things that we were talking about, but it's outside of work and it's not necessarily caused only by work stress. So it affects your mood, your body and behavior, and affects your thoughts as well. And so if you're having highly, highly negative thoughts beyond just work cynicism, though, especially if it's something that is reaching the point of thinking that you might want to harm yourself or you might be better off dead, these are very serious red flags that should not be ignored. You should tell somebody you know and trust right away and talk to them about what your plan should be to get the care you need. And the causes really are myriad. There's so many different ways that your body, the interaction between your body, your genetics, and the environmental stresses from work interact to affect your immune and endocrine system, which can cause dysfunction, result in nutrition, sleep, or exercise deficiencies, or have things that are affecting your serotonergic pathways in your brain that can benefit from selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and therapy. Genetics play a role in these illnesses. And so there's folks who have higher predisposition, but anyone can develop depression, bipolar disorder, or anxiety. And the number one cause of all of these things and driver of creating those is actually trauma. Excuse me. Okay. So burnout versus depression and anxiety. Like I said, burnout is not recognized as a diagnosable disease. It is in between distress and disease. And there's no conclusive overlap so far that depression and burnout are the same constructs, or burnout is just a precursor to depression. So those at high risk, though, do need to be screened for both burnout and clinical symptoms of anxiety and depression in order to get them connected with efficient treatment in the right amount of time. So I've got a few things listed here. You can Google them and look them up yourself. These are all pretty much available. There are burnout screeners that you can at least get a sense of. Are you checking yes to a lot of these questions? There's the MBI, the CBI, the BAT. Depression screener, really good one and ubiquitously used, very short, is a 9-question survey called the PHQ. And for anxiety, the GAD-7 only has 7 questions that ask about anxiety symptoms. And so that's a good way that if you are curious about that for yourself or for others, they're freely available. They're online. You can find them. And if you can't, email me. I'll send them to you. But it's just to get a sense of, really, should I be talking to a clinician? And honestly, if you're asking yourself that question, you'd probably benefit from talking to a clinician. So with that, I'm gonna stop the talk and open it up for public questions, and then our facilitators will at some point close down the public questions that are being recorded, and people can ask private questions in a non-recorded setting if you would like. So I do invite anyone to check out our website, learn more about what we're doing, bring us to your campus, book us for events, join us for Dragonfly Cafe, or get involved in seriously one of the coolest groups I've ever been involved in with Dragonfly Cafe, so or Dragonfly volunteership. So please, with that, I will stop and take questions.
Thank you, Wendy. That was really great. And I was just talking to my friends on the side. I'm like, I'm checking off all the things there. So I don't know if this is good or not. We'll see. We have several questions
Knowledge
coming
is
in.
Power. Avoidance is not a helpful solution.
Exactly. I think having that knowledge in my face or on other people's faces is really helpful. So we have a question here. Is there any data available if bullying can trigger burnout, or is it only workload?
Say that again. Bullying?
Yeah. Does bullying, like, is there any data that suggests that bullying can trigger burnout, or is it just solely the workload? Like
Oh
excessive?
no, bullying in the workplace is 100% one of the major features that will drive burnout for sure. So yeah, that's one of the arguments. You know, if a employer, say the university that you work at, doesn't have a strong anti-harassment or respectful workplace environment, set of protocols and things in place and like ways to report those things. This is that literature is really helpful to bring to the administrators of your organization or your workplace to be like, this is hurting everyone and everything. So if you do not have a good anti-harassment, respectful workplace set of protocols and ways to report it and ameliorate these things early and often, then that is something that's going to hurt the institution itself, as well as obviously the people that are being bullied and harassed. So the evidence is there, and it's millions and billions of dollars lost if companies and organizations don't address these things. And so that's one of the things that we at Dragonfly really like, finding all this evidence so that we can then put it in the hands of others, put it in the hands of administrators, and get them on board with prioritizing these things. Because it's not just about, it should be just that you want your employees and students to be happy and have nice, fulfilled lives. But if that's not enough, it is also hurting their bottom line.
That is so true. Wow. So this is a question that actually resonates with a lot of grad students. So what steps can a graduate student take when their supervisor is pushing them to work past their capacity?
So I would highly recommend taking or viewing our Managing Upwards workshop. So we recently developed at Dragonfly with this amazing person who just finished or is finishing up their PhD in psychological clinical duties, PsyD. And so soon to be Dr. Whitehouse is created this fantastic 2-hour workshop specifically for trainees to use and gain skills in managing upwards. And so some of the things that it involves is using a yes, but method. So someone's there, your PI, your supervisor is saying, trying to say, oh, and you should do this, and we're going to add you this onto your plate. And you can say, yes, that would be great. I'm looking forward to that opportunity. But what currently on my list do you want me to deprioritize in order to add that to the list? So the yes, but method is an excellent one to facilitate having those conversations of not just always saying yes, 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 of course, and then you're buried and you're never going to get anything on time. So that is one of the methods that is discussed in this workshop, and you get to practice them. You get to practice having those conversations too. It's fantastic.
I actually really like that approach because it kind of brings it back to them, and then they have to decide which item of the mini list that they gave you is the least priority. And then
exactly.
Very, very smart. Another question that we got is many of the qualities of burnout that this person recognizes in their peers and themselves are shown here on the slide and through your talk. But how do we identify when to say no in order to reduce the load of responsibilities on our plate if we do not have the capacity to take on more?
Yeah, so this is really what's great about setting up local peer networks and normalizing these conversations about mental health, including burnout. So by having higher literacy among yourself and your peers, you can recognize it earlier in yourself and your peers. You can, if your peers are starting to struggle or you're starting to struggle, you can go to friends, to other people who understand the workload and the timing of things and the level of stress that is expected and whatnot. And they can help you figure out like what's, when you are starting to struggle, am I struggling the same amount as everyone else, or is this beyond that? Do I need to really start saying no to more things? I'm pushing beyond my capacity. And, so communicating honestly with yourself, like self-reflecting. I myself have, this is what I do. I have lists on my whiteboards in my office. And then, so I keep a list of everything that I have responsibilities for. And if the list gets too long, you physically see the list and you're like, okay, that's too many things. And then you can start saying like, let's for myself, deprioritize these things and higher prioritize these things, and, kind of shift that focus and try to only have maybe, and it depends on each individual and how big these things are. But if you have more than 4 things on your list that you're actively like intensively working on right now, that's a lot. So if you have more than that, I would say start creating a limit for yourself of saying, this is what, same with talking to your supervisor. Yes, but what am I going to take off this list in order to do this new thing? So that's a strategy you can use with others as well as yourself.
Yeah, I find that like in my personal experience that we as students, we want to take on more because I feel like there's that constant pressure to always want to do better and like be better. But it's like an elastic band, but not really, because you do stretch, but you don't necessarily come back to the originally, like you're just by then really tired.
Yeah. So, and worst case scenario, you snap. And then it's a lot more challenging to put that rubber band back together and let that heal. Yeah. Not that rubber heals, but anyways.
Another question that we got, which is really an interesting question. Is there an increased effect of burnout if you are from a non-dominant culture or from a traditionally marginalized identity group?
Absolutely. So there's a myriad of sub issues that play into that. Some of it comes from overt microaggressions or harassment, or what is termed in the literature minority stress. So if you, so those things add to the stress that everybody else is already under, right? And then in addition to that, especially in situations like COVID, people who are international are often not able to go home very often. They leave their support structures, their family, their friend network. They don't have access to them. They can only go home once a year or once every other year. That's if they can go home and afford those plane tickets and take that time off of work and their studies. And so there's, and then that compounded by they're now also in more vulnerable positions. So international postdocs, for example, their visas, I think students often are too, dependent on their PI, their supervisor. And so sometimes it is not unusual to hear about supervisors bullying, harassing, or holding over their head of their employees, the postdocs, to pressure them to not leave, to not take vacations, to work much, much harder, and do more than what is fair, and to control their lives in a really negative way. But if your supervisor is personally responsible for your visa, that's an institutional and structural issue that really needs to be elevated to a higher level and structurally needs to change. And country by country, place by place, we're identifying where these issues are, and trying to get the institution and government and regulations and things like that to take responsibility of preventing those kinds of abuses from happening. But most certainly the stresses that are experienced by historically marginalized individuals are going to be higher, you would say, most certainly on average, not in all cases. not every person who's from a marginalized background has experienced additional minority stresses, but just the likelihood of them experiencing them is much higher.
Yep, that makes sense. So for now, we're just gonna pause recording for the last 10 minutes of the session in order for attendees who want to ask their questions without having the recording aspect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Wendy, for such a great discussion and I guess conversation about burnout. I think the chat speaks for itself. A lot of people are experiencing it, and also the conversation is real. So thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to seeing all of you at the next session, which will happen in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Have fun, everybody. Thanks so much.